Happy to be here.
Man, do we have a lot to talk about with you. First thing I do want to touch on, listen, I saw a great article this week in American Conservative. It was from you called War, Money, and America's Future, Why the Uniparty Risking a War Were So Ill-Prepared to Fight. I want everyone in our listenership, we shared it on our social medias, but we want to hear a little bit about the article from you.
All right. Well, let's put it this way. Right now, if we look at Ukraine, I would argue that the Ukrainian phase of the war is really over. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the Ukrainians have been bled white. They've lost over 400,000 men killed. Some people think as much as 450,000. I don't know. Putin, in his speech, talked about 71,000 potentially dead Ukrainian troops as a result of the last offensive. I don't know. But any way you slice it, they're losing soldiers at a rate that is about the same as the Allies lost troops in World War I on the Western Front. So remember, we fought for 110 days in the First World War, and we had 318,000 casualties. Of that number, 110,000 Americans died. So you could say that every day that we fought a battle in 1918 on the Western Front, we lost 1,000 men. That's the kind of loss that the Ukrainians are experiencing. Now, what does this mean? What it means is that we're into what I would call now the Biden phase of the Ukrainian war. What's the Biden phase? Well, it's the phase where the Ukrainians don't really have any troops to throw at the enemy. So now we're giving them long-range strike systems, 300-kilometer range missiles or 500-kilometer range missiles, 300 miles, 200 miles, 150 miles. And they're lobbing these things at the Russians, primarily in Crimea. So we just saw a major attack involving 11 Storm Shadow cruise missiles. 3 got through. The other 8 were shot down. Those 3 did damage to the dry docks and harbor in Sevastopol, to a submarine and to a capital ship, in other words, a warship. They also managed to employ some underwater unmanned systems. They call them underwater drones or water drones. They're probably British. They did some damage to Crimea. In other words, the Ukrainians have nothing left. They don't have the artillery ammunition to support a major ground attack. So the Ukrainians are lobbing long-range strike systems at the Russians. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means that we're goading the Russians into a major offensive to end the Ukrainian war. Because the Russians are looking at this and saying, well, we've already killed what consists of most of the Ukrainian army. So having killed most of it, what are we going to do now about these launches? Well, we know that the Ukrainians launched some of these strike systems from the coast of southern Ukraine between the Romanian border and Odessa. Well, Odessa is on the menu.
Yep.
So I suppose this now the that the Russians will have to cross the Dnieper River, move south and seize Odessa. They can do it. The biggest problem for the Russians down there will be logistics, because it has to come once again through Crimea and over the river down into Odessa. The Russians are also positioned to launch an offensive up in Kharkov, up in the northeast corner of Ukraine. Interestingly enough, the Ukrainians are evacuating people from both Kharkov and Odessa. So what are we going to do? Well, we can give them more long-range strike systems. We can give them F-16s at some point, even though they're going to be very hard to employ them and they can't really sustain them. But what are we going to do? And this is the key question, because we've reached the point now where we either have to say, that's it, we can't do anything else because to do much else risks direct war with Russia, or we get more deeply involved. We actually talk about the use of our own ground forces. Now, I don't know which way this is going to go, but I can tell you that if we're going to risk a direct confrontation with Russia, we're not prepared. We don't have the months of ammunition. We don't have the means of reinforcement. If we go to war with Russia, the Russian submarine fleet will sink everything that tries to cross the Atlantic. Can't be done. If you can't move reinforcements across the Atlantic, guess what? You're in a lot of trouble in Europe. This means that there are 32 member states who potentially now offer targets to the Russians. The Russians don't have to sit there and take damage from us from long-range strike weapons. If they find out we're launching weapons from Poland, from Romania, from Slovakia, they can attack those places, from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Remember, they've got 300,000 troops sitting in reserve, and they're continuing to quietly mobilize with the goal of reaching 1.2 million, probably in January or February of next year. So we're in a terrible position if we want to wage war with the Russians. So why are we doing it? Why are we poking them? Why are we provoking them? Why are we giving the Ukrainians weapons with which they can attack targets inside Russia? Because that's an invitation to a broader war.
That certainly is. How alarming is it to you to see Vladimir Zelensky going to be on a plane in a couple days and up on Capitol Hill asking Congress for more money and weapons and having a state dinner with Joe Biden next week?
Well, I'd rather he eat with Biden than me. I have no desire to do that. And I could imagine that must be a very confusing meal, past the salt, and God knows what Biden is going to hand him. So I don't want to go to that. But Zelensky is coming for a $21 billion payoff.
Yep.
More money thrown down the rat hole when there's absolutely no chance for Zelensky to win. There never has been. And his government is really miserably unpopular inside Ukraine. Remember, they're now pulling people off the streets. They're headed into the Carpathian Mountains to find any living human beings they can. They want NATO governments to round up military-age eligible Ukrainian men and ship them back to Ukraine to die in the Russian meat grinder. I mean, this is a catastrophe. The inhumane dimension cannot be overstated,
right? Because
the wounds that these Ukrainian soldiers are receiving on the battlefield are wounds from which most of them will never recover.
Yeah.
We don't know how many amputees are, but there are tens of thousands of them. I've heard some people say 70,000. I've heard others say 60,000. I mean, the whole thing is insane. There's no chance for a victory here. So what else is he going to be told while he's there? Well, I'm being told that Blinken and Nuland are saying, well, we have to have a freeze. We have to freeze the battlefronts. That's the only way forward. Well, the Russians aren't going to freeze anything. The Russians have a set of demands. We have been unwilling to consider any of them.
Yep.
At the beginning of this whole thing, these were requests. Now they're demands that have to be met. Ukraine cannot join NATO. End of discussion. So that means Ukraine can be neutral. Now, I don't know what other conditions may be attached to it, but we can certainly live with neutrality. We don't need Ukraine in NATO. In fact, Ukraine as a neutral state is a wonderful idea. It puts almost 500 miles between us and the Russians.
Yeah.
Why is that a bad thing? It's not a bad thing. But see, the larger problem is that the goals that we originally stated, when I say we, I'm talking about people like Blinken and Austin and Nuland and Biden and Sullivan and others, was to harm Russia, harm its economy, weaken the state, potentially overthrow or remove Putin. It's all nonsense. The opposite has happened. Russia is stronger now than it's been since the 1980s. Its military establishment is probably the best of its kind, I would say certainly in Europe and maybe in the world, given the enormous armaments that they've managed to turn out, brand new equipment, the tactics they've used, the organizational construct they've built. What are we trying to accomplish? We're not going to get it. We're not going to get a freeze. The Russians are going to say, freeze yourself, stick your head in the freezer. It's not going to happen in Ukraine. So where are we headed? Well, I'm afraid we're headed to more escalation until finally the Russians are standing on the Polish border. And my fear has always been that we would become desperate because we can't do anything other than throw boulders at them over the wall.
Yep.
This is sort of like siege warfare. If you can't take them on, what do? You start hurling crap over the wall. That's what we're doing. It's not going to win. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to improve our strategic position. So I'm worried about desperation in the West. Now, of course, it may be, given Europe's really fragile economic condition right now, that Europe collapses financially and economically before anything gets much further. I mean, we're in trouble too.
Yeah.
All you have to do is turn on the business channels and people say, oh, Treasury yields are up. Prices for bonds are down. Nobody wants our bonds. Oh, by the way, trillions in U.S. treasuries are being dumped by China, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. This is not a good thing for us. We're in trouble. So you would think someone with any sense of balance or rationality would say, gee, we probably ought to find a way out of this. Let's get some sort of deal on the table and put an end to this thing. But it's not happening.
It certainly isn't. Listen, I do want to talk about a state dinner that was a little bit more important than the one between Joe Biden and Vladimir Zelensky that's going to happen this week, and that's the one between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. When you saw the hermit dictator make it out of the kingdom and then stick around for an extended stay in Moscow, what are the optics of that? And in the big scheme of things here, I mean, Vladimir Putin's always trying to play 2 moves ahead. What does it mean for, the global battlefront as it's shaping up right now?
Well, first, let's make something clear. Mr. Kim has not missed many meals. So if you offer him something to eat, he's going to show up. I'll guarantee it. Other than that, this is much more important for Mr. Kim than it is for Putin. What Putin has done is sent a clear and unambiguous signal to us. You refuse to cooperate with us. You won't talk with us. You won't negotiate with us. You continue to try and harm us. Fine. Then we will provide to Mr. Kim the missile body and the warhead that he needs to have an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, that can mount a nuclear warhead and, if necessary, reach targets in the United States. So he's done that. Xi in Beijing has always fought that and objected to it. Chinese don't like North Korea. North Korea is a dangerous catalyst for conflict. The Chinese are about stability, not war. And the Chinese have enormous problems at home themselves. Problems with unemployment, problems with real estate, problems with corruption. But the Chinese have relented and told Putin, all right, you can do it. Give Kim this capability. The capability is designed to terrify the hell out of us. You know what? It works.
Yeah.
I'm not reassured in the least that Mr. Kim has this capability. I don't think he's crazy, but I don't like the idea that he's got it. And by the way, keep your eye on Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, Latin America, because things there could get very dicey very quickly. We have open borders. We don't know what's going on in Mexico and Central America in most cases. The places are overrun with Russian and Chinese influence, agents, spies, intelligence officers. All of these can contribute to one hell of an explosion inside the United States when they want it to. We're not thinking about that. If we had any brains at all, we'd secure the border, start rounding up illegals and boot them out. We're not doing it. We're not enforcing our own laws anywhere. Criminality is out of control. Well, this is a wonderful opportunity if you're sitting in the Kremlin and you're trying to think of new ways to tie down U.S. resources, new ways to heighten the dangers to Americans. Well, this is what we've got. It's called horizontal escalation. That's what it is. It's different from what we normally think about. We're vertical thinkers. Send Ukraine a new missile that goes further. The Russians are a little more sophisticated. They know that we have a soft underbelly in the Caribbean and Latin America. I would look for real trouble down there. We've already got it, let's face it, in terms of illegal human trafficking and drugs.
Sure.
But it can get a lot worse.
Yeah, it's you paint such a bright picture heading into the weekend here, Colonel. Here's the thing. We love having you on the show, and we love having these hard conversations because the fact of the matter is